So I really love Dark Crystal and Labyrinth and all the stuff that Jim Henson has done over the years, and I'm also a big fan of the TV show that Netflix ran last year. I binged that pretty quickly, actually. I thought it was great. A really good continuation of the Dark Crystal mythos, and really caught the essence of what Jim Henson was doing with the series, or with the movie anyway, all those years ago. So in that context, I was really looking forward to this tactics RPG that was based on the show and gave me a chance to play with my favourite characters from the show and, you know, really kind of indulge that. Unfortunately, it's not very good at all, and this is now the second time I've been disappointed by Netflix and its approach to video games, because I believe it is the same group that actually made this, that made the Stranger Things 3 video game from last year, and I found that to be a complete disappointment as well. This one's made better than the Stranger Things game. It does have that going for it, but it's still not good. It's you know, tactics RPGs is a great genre and I really do enjoy them, but this one doesn't really do the genre or the TV show justice. So the first issue that I have with this game is that it really does rely on you understanding the TV show and having watched it through in its entirety. And while that's not an issue for me personally, because I'd obviously followed the TV show so I could fill in all the blanks, there are just so many blanks and narrative plot holes in this one. It barely does an effort to introduce characters. Story sequences are super short and brief, and it's like this kind of clipping from the show just to remind you what point of the show you're up to when you get to that particular scene. So it's more just a kind of a summary of, you know, key plot points, and you have to fill in all the gaps yourself, which it does two things. Firstly, obviously, if you're not an existing fan of the show, you're not going to be able to get along with this one at all. You're going to find it very confusing. You're not going to get along with the characters. You're not really going to understand what's going on, or the implications of major events and all that kind of stuff. It's not friendly for newcomers by any means. The second issue is that even if you do understand the narrative, if you've already watched the TV show, this game doesn't tell a good story. It doesn't do anything with the story. All it does is give you an inferior version of the story that you've already watched. And that's a real missed opportunity. They could have done all kinds of things. They could have expanded on the story in some way. They could have introduced side characters or related plot points that were going on in the world through the TV show but weren't depicted in the TV show itself. They could have done that route. Or they could have just told the story itself in a better way, so that it felt like you were getting something out of it. A good example, I guess, is the Koei Tecmo kind of Warriors games, particularly Arslan, for example. Arslan, the game was released at the same time that the anime was, but you didn't have to have watched the anime to be able to play the game and get a sense of the plot, because the summary that they provided was really more than sufficient to follow along with the characters and all that kind of stuff. If you're going to make a game that's not self-contained, you are definitely not going to make a game that tells a good story in itself. So that was the first issue that I had with this one. I immediately felt like I was wasting my time, because I'm a narrative person. I do like my games to have good, strong story. I felt like I was wasting my time in playing this one because I just wasn't getting anything out of it. The second issue is that the game is a tactics RPG in theory, but in execution it doesn't really show any understanding about what makes a tactics RPG great. So when I think about what makes a really good tactics RPG enjoyable to play, it's that firstly there's tactics involved, in that you have to move around the levels, you need to have a good combination of characters and skills and things, and you need to have a sense of where to place characters, you need to have some kind of strategy going into each level. This one doesn't really have any of that. It's all very small skirmishes of just a couple of pieces on each side, and the levels themselves are tiny and small, and there's no real incentive to make use of those levels either. There's a couple of levels here and there where you need to move to certain points and flick switches or push enemies into certain spaces, but because the levels are so small and because the overall use of those levels is so limited, it ends up being just a kind of a face-off in the middle, basically, between both sides. And that's it. In terms of skills, there's too much crossover between the characters. So there's three main types of character class. There's the warrior, there's the scout, and then there's the magic user slash healer. And later on, you unlock more combinations and more kinds of skills. But in each case, you can have a primary and a secondary class, and you can select at will which skills within those classes you want to use. So really, there's so much homogenization between the characters. What ends up happening is that you've got characters that do a bit of everything, and every character has such a crossover with other characters in terms of skills and stuff that there's no real sense that characters are distinct to one another. So you'll take the same characters into each battle. You'll make sure that each character has enough of the full range of skills that they kind of work on their own as well. There's no real incentive to work with the characters, work the characters together in collaboration with one another. They all kind of function independently, and it just becomes this kind of grind where you just use the same skills battle after battle, use the same characters battle after battle, and use them in the same way every battle. So yeah, it's a disappointing on that regard as well. We've seen some really great tactics RPGs come through in the last couple of years. I mean, Disgaea's the obvious one that's been kicking around for quite a while now, but there was stuff like God Hand, which was released on all consoles, and it's a 200-hour tactics RPG where every character is very distinct to one another and has their own role in the battlefield, and you needed to really work them together quite well. So this genre, there aren't too many games in it, but those kinds of games that are there tend to be very high quality these days and tend to be very distinct in what they do. This one doesn't really have any of that sense. I think the biggest problem with this game is it just doesn't add anything to the Dark Crystal, and that's a real pity because there's so much that could be added to the Dark Crystal. I thought licensed games over the last generation or so had become really good because developers were starting to look for ways to use their game to add to the existing property. So you look at something like Spider-Man or Mad Max or the Batman games or the Lord of the Rings games that have come out in recent times, and those games all take the base property and then try and find some way of doing things a little bit different with it. And in doing so, as a fan of that property, you get something different to what you'd already experienced. So if you're a fan of Spider-Man, for example, you would then go and play the Insomniac Spider-Man game, and it would be something different. It would be something that you hadn't already read or seen before. And I thought that was the way that licensed games were going, because a couple of generations ago, licensed games did not have a good reputation at all. They were very much B-tier kind of cash-ins, and were infamous for it, where you'd have a popular movie and then you'd immediately have a game out which would just copy the basic plot of that movie as closely as possible, but simmer it down and turn it into a video game. That video game would be shoved on storefronts, and you'd play it for about 5 minutes as a fan and move on because it just didn't add anything to the existing franchise. And I thought those days were over because those games were kind of very B-tier, and we had a few publishers that kind of specialized in them. Companies like THQ and whatever, and Activision, and they all kind of pulled back from making those games. They stopped doing them because they became quite expensive to produce as a B-tier game, and people were sick of them and weren't really buying them, so they stopped doing that. But it looks like Netflix is absolutely determined to bring them back, because the Stranger Things 3 game was a really good example of that. Did nothing to add to Stranger Things, just took little snippets from the TV show and packaged it up in a kind of a really cheap Diablo clone. And they've done exactly the same thing here. They've taken the Dark Crystal TV show, taken little snippets of the plot, done really nothing to add to that, and then package it up in a tactics RPG, which functionally works, but doesn't really add anything to the tactics RPG genre. It's not a standout example of that genre, and doesn't add anything to the Dark Crystal franchise either. So it's really unoriginal, and to be honest, really quite uninteresting. So anyway, like I said, that it is a big disappointment. I am a big fan of my tactics RPGs. I do play them whenever I can. We don't get that many of them, so I do pay attention when there is a new one on the way. And I'm a big fan, like I said, of the Dark Crystal. I think that it's actually a property that has so much material that would work really well in game form, because it's that kind of pulp fantasy, but also that wildly imaginative kind of world building and character design. So a tactics RPG is actually the right way to go for it. I thought that was the right choice, but the execution was really lacking, and unfortunately that's what's let it down in the end. Anyway, I will have a review up on digitallydownloaded.net as well, so you can check out my thoughts in written form if you want. It should be up about the same time that this video is, otherwise within a day or so. Otherwise, yes, please do like and subscribe to me on YouTube if you enjoy my videos. I appreciate that, of course, and you won't miss a video if you do that. And if you do enjoy my videos, please do follow me on Patreon or back me on Patreon. Even $1 a month really does help and lets me continue to make these things. I do try and be positive most of the time with the games that I do cover, because I do think that there's merit in a lot of stuff that a lot of other people don't see merit in. But yeah, with this one, it didn't work for me. Anyway, thanks very much for watching, and we will see you at the next one.